Hi, this is Tony Devine, Managing Partner at the Grey Matters Network. This is one of our series on a series of podcasts with one of our experts. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Caroline Hughes. Caroline Hughes has had a long and successful career in a variety of international and global companies, mostly in a HR discipline. Do you want to give us a bit more about your background, Caroline?
Yeah, thanks, Tony, and hi, everyone. Yeah, as you said, yeah, the career is getting longer actually by the day, but mostly in HR and predominantly the roles I've had are in talent management, leadership development, and leading large scale transformation. And very fortunate to look and work in brilliant organizations like the Central Bank during the Troika program, where I was head of change, and also in CRH, where I was a global leadership development director until recently. And so very fortunate that I've always had kind of nice, big, juicy roles that I could get stuck into and really lend my skills and keep learning all of the time.
Juicy, another word for challenging, perhaps. But in terms of what we want to talk about today, so Caroline, you want to talk a bit to us today about burnout and the whole concept of physical, emotional, and mental well-being. So do you want to tell us a bit about what is the difference between being a workaholic and somebody who's just suffering from burnout?
Yeah, good question. Good question. I guess maybe to say, first of all, I suppose my experience of and my interest in burnout is more through my direct experience than through academic. But, as with anything that happens, that's a significant event in our lives, I have taken to researching it. And, what's really interesting is I've found it's not just the workaholics that might be prone to burnout. In fact, one of my doctors said to me last year, lazy people don't get burnout. It's the trusted lieutenant. It's the person you turn to for one more thing. And so this kind of categorization of, susceptible individuals, the workaholic, the driving hard, the focused, results orientated, I will get it done, come what may. And then you have the people pleaser, this particularly the high people pleaser who will, jump through hoops for you because they gave their word, their loyalty, and their own image is kind of wound up in, pleasing the master, as is the term commonly used in psychology. And then the third is people with high perfectionistic tendencies, and particularly when they're in very big jobs of, quite large breadth and scale, where, no matter how much time is available, the same attention to detail needs to be given to absolutely everything. And you can kind of understand how that will start to cause stress over time. And the fourth, which I think is a bit misnamed, but it's called the duck. I would prefer to think of it as a swan, but there you go, where it's like, when you look at a duck above water, it's quite a serene looking character, gliding along on the lake. And of course, under the waterline, the feet are flapping away and going like crazy. So this anxiety that tends to arise, as work starts to become overwhelming. But the presentation of the individual is, nope, all is fine here. I'm fine. And so when you think of burnout through that lens, I suppose it could happen to quite a number of people, but more often it's probably the person that gets consistently turned to for that one more thing.
Mm. And Caroline, is it quite prevalent in the workplace?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, certainly the conversation during the pandemic, I suppose, has focused more on physical, emotional, and mental well-being, as we've talked on before. But what's been interesting is there was a survey done in the UK earlier this year where 61% of executives surveyed had reported that they had formed some type of burnout over the previous 12 months. And that was been put down to kind of a number of factors. The first was, of course, the ongoing crisis of COVID, thinking you're there for one short sprint in the month of March and finding ourselves still there 18 months later, and operating at that pace, that crisis management pace for so long. The second was actually the blurring of the boundaries between home life and work life. And that was, I suppose, at varying degrees of success depending on personal circumstances. And the third was actually, particularly during the last 12 months, where with so many lockdowns, people simply didn't take holidays because there was nowhere to go, so they might as well work. So actually the prevalence of burnout has increased, but I think also more importantly, talking about burnout has increased, and I think slowly removing the shame and the blame of suffering burnout and knowing that you can recover and return and bounce back quite well.
And would there be a gender difference? You know, as a man, I would never admit to ever burning out.
Yeah, you know, they say women are more likely to burn out, particularly where you have, you know, imposter syndrome, woman in a man's world, the pressures, particularly of home versus career, where women tend to, but not exclusively, take a more, you know, dominant role or have an expectation of role. But it's not exclusive. And certainly, actually, if I look at my own client base, actually my own client base are mostly men, because they're looking for somewhere to go, looking for that safe haven so that they can pull back from the brink and do very practical things before it gets to the point of having to, you know, press the red button.
Another thought that comes to mind, or question, Caroline, is, you know, for the employer, for the leader, for the manager, so what? Isn't it great that I have somebody who will seeks to please, who is always available to do the next thing, will, you know, answer emails at midnight? So what's in it for the employer to manage the workforce so that there isn't a high degree of burnout?
Yeah, it's tempting, isn't it? It's tempting to continue along that line where if I ask, you answer. Absolutely. But, you know, the world of work has really changed, hasn't it? And particularly in the last kind of 18 months, where people's expectations of work are beginning to change. And some of these old mindsets around, you know, please the master, or I am the boss, therefore you do, even though that's been kind of hedged away at quite a lot recently. Like, that's where you've got to be worried about your reputation in the market. Have you got a reputation for being a very tough place to work? Do you have very high attrition rates? Do you have a lot of potentially even, you know, cases against you around, you know, not necessarily burnout per se, but the culture and the environment? Because the research from Gallup would show that where you have a high prevalence of burnout, there is a 50% correlation between the work environment, the culture that's created, and then the individual's ability to put good boundaries in place. So as a leader, as an owner of an organization, I suppose it is worth paying attention to the culture that you're creating so that you can meet your customer demands. You can have the productive workforce that you want, because, you know, happy people do more work fundamentally. And so by investing in what I would call kind of well-being strategies and conversations, rather than well-meaning ones, that this is the lip service, well, you can actually start to see a return in terms of your productivity, but also how you treat people who are on sick leave, and giving them space to recover and to return.
Very good. And Caroline, your own personal experience of burnout, do you want to talk to us a wee bit about that?
Yeah, I'll try and give you the summary of what was about an 18-month recovery. I suppose if I think about it in terms of, you know, lessons learned, I mean, I was doing big jobs for a very long time. I climbed mountains kind of for my pastime to de-stress. So everything was on that high octane space. And I used to say to people, you know, if they said, oh, you know, how do you keep going? How are you still doing it? I'd say, oh, don't ask me. If I think about it, I'm going to fall over. And that is exactly what happened. I collapsed one morning. And that was the start of about an 18-month recovery. And what I would say is that burnout is complicated because everyone's burnout is different, but it has very clear, you know, similarities. So the World Health Organization says that burnout is a workplace phenomenon, which kind of feeds into that 50-50 piece I talked about earlier. But on the personal side, burnout has really three big components. One is the physical and mental exhaustion of simply having done too much for too long, that, you know, withstanding the pressure as it gradually becomes stress. And then strategies to try to cope with that. Because when I reflect, there was a point when all the fun of the game started to become, I wouldn't have ever called it stressful, but certainly an underlying anxiety, you know, putting your head on the pillow and your brain decides to come to life and rewrite the day, you know, that kind of stuff is how it starts, because it doesn't start with the big bang. It starts with many signs before. And then the second part of burnout is almost this cynicism, you know, I'm just giving up. Maybe I'm good for nothing. I'm useless. That, you know, it's a very kind of heavy judgment place. And particularly if people are prone to judgment to keep them going, the good enough, you know, that can be a very, very hard component of burnout. And then the third is that real, you know, well, what's wrong with me? You know, I used to be able to do this. Why can't I do this? Everyone else is doing this. You know, why can't I? I have to sit in a room and get myself well. And what does it mean to rest and sit still? And I went through all of that. And what I would say is recovery from burnout is not a linear thing that you can say step 1, step 2, step 3. But in the combination of, you know, looking after the physical and mental exhaustion, looking after the, where are you, where's your inner voice, and how do you bring yourself back up from this heavy self-judgment into a fully functioning being in the world. And it's a bit more like navigating a maze with a dimly lit torch than actually saying, now, you know, do not, you know, pass go, and you pick up your chip and then you go to the next piece and you pass go again. So I'd say to anyone who's in this situation, you know, try things that might work. Doesn't matter if it's in the garden, mowing the lawn, you know, things like that, that will just allow you just to leave the laptop and the phone and the stresses of the demand of life and just step into something either physical, or sea swimming is very popular these days. You know, it's really about developing micro habits that are nearly too small to fail, because they're simple things that you can do without big effort. And I would say that was one of the big keys for me in my recovery, that I needed to just surrender and stop trying to project manage my recovery as if it was another deadline that had to be done by X date. Because I realized actually the more I should, with more of that should language that came into my head, actually it started to prevent my full recovery. It was good for a while because it was motivating, but actually it was ultimately what would make it worse.
Carla, it's been fantastic, and I really appreciate you sharing those personal experiences with us, and I'm sure others will benefit from listening to this podcast as a result. I mean, if I was to pick up on the few items that, you know, really resonated for me, I mean, you talk about boundaries, you've mentioned a safe haven, you've also, you know, I guess sent a message to employers and organizations that, you know, it's in your best interest to mind your employees, watch for the signs and support them. If you were to, I guess, put forward, you know, three main points, three main bullets, what would they be?
So I would say, firstly, to employers, if there are people in your team with this, get curious rather than judgmental, first and foremost. If you find yourself thinking, something in this for me, really pay attention to what's happening in your body, really get very, very present, and find somewhere to talk.
Fantastic. Look, at that was incredibly insightful, Caroline. Really appreciate your time and really appreciate those interesting and very insightful points. If you would like to talk to or meet with people like Caroline Hughes, our colleagues in the Grey Matters Network, please contact us here at thegreymattersnetwork.com. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.